I'm not trying to diss Windsurf. They've got good technology for sure. But OpenAI has got a lot of engineers. They've already released their Codex product themselves,
Yeah.
which
So
uh,
why are they doing it?
because they want the users. They want the foothold.
Morning, Sam. How are you?
I'm good, Matt. How are you doing today?
Doing good. The pace hasn't slowed in the AI world. What we're seeing now is OpenAI almost scrambling to kind of catch up in the coding race to be there for the agentic future, right? So OpenAI, once the undisputed leader setting the AI agenda over the last couple of years, is now defending its position in the face of competition from Google and Anthropic. And we're seeing this potential Windsurf acquisition, right? The acquisition of this really popular IDE, right? This platform to developers to create code in an agentic way. And this is a key piece of the story. And it signals, one, the need to supply coding abilities to this crucial developer ecosystem. And two, this broader battle to become that primary starting point, right? The interface for an agentic AI world. Do you see it that way?
Look, totally OpenAI is on the back foot at the moment, right? They had their 4.1 models, which were basically, I was calling them the catch-up models. They had their O3 release, which was, I would say, was received well, but not great. I and then they, at the same time, they launched their Codex thing, which was their answer to sort of Claude Code. And it hasn't been a huge hit, right? People are not talking about it. People are not necessarily doing lots of YouTube videos about it or things like this that we've seen for Claude Code. So, yeah, I definitely think they're on the back foot at the moment. I think it's really interesting, sort of how they've gotten there. One of the things that most people don't realize that have sort of just, seen the past couple of years is that OpenAI was one of the early ones to actually champion these models for coding. They literally had a model, in the early days called Codex, which was very awesome. And then they sort of deprecated it because they said they didn't have enough GPUs to run that. And, I think it was, GPT-4 back in the day. So it's kind of funny that they sort of championed this thing, and now they're being left behind by Anthropic and by Google with these super, coding models. Like, really, we've got Anthropic's, Claude 3.7, and definitely the sort of new one is the Gemini Pro 2.5 model, which just got updated this week. And clearly Google focused on updating its coding abilities. So yeah, look, I definitely think that OpenAI is in their sort of great catch-up phase at the moment.
Right. And it might seem odd for some of our viewers or listeners to talk about OpenAI being on the back foot when it's simultaneously talking about this massive increase in users, right? So moving from like something like 400 million, active users per, was it daily active users just a couple of months ago, and then it had that new image feature that really propelled it to something like more like 700 or even 800 million, right? At the same time, it's growing like crazy. So why are we talking about this? I think the reason why we're talking about the back foot is because everyone knows that it's not just a consumer play, that the enterprise play, and this is especially the case for our audience here at VentureBeat. I know you're doing a lot of developer work, Sam, for developers. That over the last 3 or 4 months, this really has come into play. That OpenAI's leadership has really dissipated in a lot of the kind of the leading edge of the technology delivery here, right? So you're absolutely right, and so then this is showing up in the usage of these coding agent platforms, right? These new really hot platforms where developers are going to, to the high level, vibe coding, just writing in a prompt about what they want to create and having this agentic platform, whether it's Cursor, Windsurf, right? There's Replit, there's a bunch of these out there. And then Google saying, hey, we've got a model that's really doing well here. You're actually seeing stats where Google Anthropic especially, right, with Sonnet 3.5 and now 3.7 being the defaults, right, and overtaken OpenAI in this really important distribution channel. And so this, I think this is key, right? This is why we're talking about it. So then, OpenAI is now reportedly seeking to acquire Windsor for $3 billion, according to the reporting. This is crazy, right? A valuation for a reported maybe 40 million in annualized revenue, right? That's very little revenue for a company that's being acquired for $3 billion, and it's because of the strategic importance, right? And it reflects this reality, and it would be clearly the biggest acquisition to date. They're now tacking again, right, from wanting to move to a for-profit, right, this huge process, right? The last funding kind of actually required some of these things to fall into place, right? For, I think it was SoftBank's full investment to come in. It needed to change for this to this for-profit company. But now it's saying it's moving back to this need to be a public benefit company, right? And so a lot of changes in the ecosystem. And I think this is important for our viewers and the technical decision makers in the enterprise, because it has to do with reliability and consistency. And so it's another sign of a concession that, hey, wow, there's so much competition here, right? And so it's a big change where OpenAI also, in another point, can't necessarily count on that previous relationship it had with Microsoft, right? Microsoft's Satya Nadella is increasingly talking about this open garden that it has, right? It supported MCP, right? The protocol that all these, agentic players are needing to use. It actually just came out this week to support the A2A protocol, right? That Google itself launched, and that maybe some others were holding back. Certainly OpenAI and Anthropic were holding back from, right? This protocol to allow agents to talk with agents.
You don't make lots of money by people coming onto your system and making a Ghibli image, once a month, right? That's not going to drive. That's not going to drive revenue. But the thing that people are using every day, that Anthropic especially has done so well at, and now Google's trying to catch up with, massively, and looks like they kind of have caught up with the model at least, is that coders are using these tools to write code. And so, there was an interesting interview with the founder of Windsurf, talking about that they kind of feel that their goal is to basically reduce coding by 99%, right? To just make it so much easier. And they kind of feel that they've done 40% already.
So Sam, let's move to part 2 of this, right? Which is this coding arms race. Why Windsurf, right? Or a Windsurf-like asset, why it's critical for OpenAI. We've touched on this, but what makes Windsurf's coding IDE particularly noteworthy, right? Have you played around with it at all?
I've played around with it. I mostly use Cursor. I've been definitely, sort of trying out Windsurf. It's definitely nice software, right? All of these are these VS Code forks, right? And we've seen that apparently OpenAI, was trying to buy Cursor. And Cursor's now just gotten so expensive that their last raise is what, at a valuation of $9 billion.
Yeah, something like that, right? They were the
And
perceived leader, right? So they
yeah,
were.
and they're supposedly they're getting close to 300 million ARR, with what they're doing. So they're just too expensive, right? You can't sort of justify buying them, perhaps, if you're Sam Altman. But getting Windsurf quickly, maybe this does give them a foothold into having something where they can capture a lot of those users. You got to wonder too, though, if those users suddenly go, hang on a minute, I don't want to use the OpenAI models. I want to use Anthropic. I want to use Google. Is OpenAI going to let them still use that, or are people going to jump and go to Cursor or go to some of these other tools that are out there? I don't think it's really about the actual product, right? I don't, if OpenAI wanted to, they could replicate everything inside Windsurf. It's not the tech that they're buying. They're buying a user base here. They really need to have a good, strong foothold to take on Cursor, and more importantly, to take on Anthropic and Google.
Yeah, right. And it's not like Windsurf has sewn this market up, right? It's very early. So it's not necessarily I would push back on the sense that they're buying users, but I think you're right in the sense that the prospect of users, right, is that this is a distribution channel. This company began in 2021 as Exafunction, right, focusing on GPU utilization and inference, right, and then pivoted in 2022 when it realized that the real revolution was in generative AI, and then focused on very early on creating an agentic approach to this co-pilot approach for an IDE. They were the first to ship an agentic IDE, right, with that context compression, specialty being on that inference because of its GPU background, right? And so it's brought those two together in a really interesting, compelling way. But you're saying it's not technology, that OpenAI could actually build this in-house, but wouldn't OpenAI have to take time to do that?
I'm not trying to diss Windsurf. They've got good technology for sure. But OpenAI has got a lot of, engineers. They've already released their Codex product themselves,
Yeah.
which,
So okay. So
right,
why are they doing it?
because they want the users. They want the foothold. Just recently at Cloud Next, I went and spoke to the Windsurf people there. One of the things that they told me is that they are winning, while Cursor's winning with the average developer, that's sort of a one-person developer, Windsurf is winning at getting big companies with really big code bases. In fact, the thing that they told me that their specialty was code bases with sort of 1 million lines up, right? And that's going to be your sort of big banks, all your really big enterprise customers. And so if they are getting those enterprise customers, that's going to be a huge win to basically, that's what OpenAI is buying here, is basically buying those sort of customers into their ecosystem. And my guess is even if they let those people keep using Anthropic's model, OpenAI is going to get a lot of intelligence out of this. They're going to be able to see what people like, what people don't like. They're going to be able to customize their own models to be a better fit for this. There's going to be lots of advantages to them that is not necessarily about, the raw technology there. It's more about getting the customer, getting the users, being able to learn from those as quickly as possible.
Right. And I think when it comes to the technology, I think there's a differentiation, as you say, from Cursor and some of these others because of their GPU background. They were focused, I think, a little bit more on that enterprise grade, as you were saying, those larger code bases. But if you actually look at the way they're moving, talking with some venture capitalists and others here in the Bay Area, I think there's another question around the churn that Cursor has, right? So Cursor has, obviously an increasing revenue rate, and it's really impressive, right? Obviously, huge credit to what they've done. But I think there's a little gossip around the significant amount of churn, right? Developers go there quickly, but then when they want to deploy, they haven't done as much work to actually deploy in enterprise settings, right? Replit has done a lot of work on enterprise, right? And to your point, the folks at Windsurf have really focused a lot more on this. And, seem to be having things like, their flow feature keeps an eye on the kind of the bigger, code base context, kind of awareness, along with Cascade, right, across the entire code base, and enabling these coherent changes across multiple files, and, kind of awareness of that entire project as it's proposing these kind of lower level suggestions, right?
I think you make an interesting point, and to sort of just go on from that is that, okay, so at the moment you've got Cursor, you've got Windsurf, you've got Bolt, you've got Lovable. All of these companies are doing quite
Replit.
well. Definitely, Cursor and Windsurf are the two top ones, right? But it's even amazing to see, companies like Lovable just come out and be at 10 million ARR within a month or two of, release, kind of thing. For me, the biggest takeaway there is that this is where the money is with these models at the moment. It's not people just going in and, chatting with ChatGPT. It's, it doesn't seem like it's just things like deep research. While those things are, getting people to use it, my guess is that people are not using deep research every day, but coders are going in and sitting there for, hours and hours each day using these pieces, these IDEs with these models to be able to, build software and do their work. And so you've got to think that that's sort of like what's driving this. Is that OpenAI has realized that, okay, we kind of perhaps underestimated how much code was going to be the big thing first. And don't get me wrong, I think that there's going to be other dominoes that fall. Code is the first one, but we will see other ones fall over the next couple of years for sure. But OpenAI realizes, and I think to give Sam Altman some credit, I think this is where he realizes that you need to be sort of like in people's mind share all the time, right? You need to be the one that they're thinking about. And the moment that they stop thinking about you because, oh, I don't code, but I've heard that the coders don't like this thing, so therefore maybe it's no good. Therefore, I'm going to try these other models. That's going to be like death to OpenAI. So I think Sam Altman's realized, no. It doesn't matter if it's going to cost us $3 billion. We need to jump in. We need to get one of these things, and we need to basically run with it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what you're seeing is, OpenAI had this amazing focus on research, right? And it was the first to get to these, reasoning models with O1, has a massive adoption of the consumer side, right? Great UI, right? But this area in the middle, right? So now it's trying to figure out how to get caught up on coding, but also this idea, and I think Windsurf might help on this, right? In terms of kind of the mindset, is moving to this fully fledged project management, right? Debugging, development, and it needs that all within the UI. We're going to get to the kind of the UI point here, finally, but just in terms of the other things here, to touch on briefly, right? Comparison with kind of like the Google AI Studio. You did a lot of work there. I've done some work in terms of our own projects here at VentureBeat. What I found is that you putting some of these prompts of creating create an agent for this or that in Google AI Studio, using Gemini, or right, you're doing it in Windsurf. Like what have you found kind of roughly the comparisons here?
Google's AI Studio, that's basically just a front end for their model, right? There's nothing really. You can get an API key there. You can sort of look at the code of how to run it and stuff like that there. That's not an IDE, right? That's quite different than what Google's basically done as a plugin for VS Code and what Cursor and Windsurf have done, with their own forks of VS Code. The other thing I would say, just to sort of drive this home a little bit too, is that the code stuff is about to make a shift, right? So we've been talking a lot, and for the past year or so, people have been using these tools where you've gone in, you've prompted it, you've gotten something back, you've looked at the code, you perhaps run it, you then prompt it again. There's this give and take sort of thing. I definitely over the past only couple months, and I think Windsurf is one of the people leading this, is now people are moving to an agentic thing where you perhaps work out like a whole product requirements doc, you put that in there, and then it just goes off and grinds itself to be able to basically have agentic coding, right? So where you've got these things actually doing coding. Now, from what I've seen, clearly Windsurf and Cursor are the two that are, at the forefront of this. Also, Claude Code seems to be very good at this as well. Listening to what some of the Claude Code people are talking about, they're focused on this as the future. And my guess is that this is what OpenAI is also seeing as the future, that, you need to get one of these things now, because once they can all do it, people are not going to shift. Right, like it's sort of once something becomes popular and once it meets all your requirements, you're kind of happy with it, right? You don't need to go looking for something new because all your requirements are already met. And I think this is why OpenAI is moving with the speed it is to get Windsurf, right? Is to basically, to capture this agentic coding that we're sort of just on the cusp of seeing, over the past couple of months.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And, again, we go back to Windsurf's flows features, right? It's compatible with OpenAI's emphasis on this advanced reasoning around coding, right? Aware of multi-step thinking, the ability to reassess or even retrace steps, right? You need, right, that specificity, right? And again, keeping that whole project in mind, going back and forth. I think we've already talked about this in past podcasts, right? Which is the enterprise now in this world is going to need the sandbox to actually experiment even before it deploys with a lot of this. And I think this is a big part of that experimentation. Even if you can't use a lot of these tools within their existing pipelines and deployment and orchestration, right? It's got to be this has got to be a race for enterprises' ability to actually start, and then the OpenAIs of the world, the Anthropics and Googles can convert these folks into customers, presumably, as you say, once they're addicted to that flow.
Where this is going to really show up is you're going to start seeing more and more people in enterprises that are not coders, have never coded, have never learned to code, suddenly use these tools to make software. And that software is going to basically be custom CRM. That's going to be, some kind of unique to-do system, or all these sorts of things that someone in an organization has got a great idea for, but currently they're forced to use Salesforce, they're forced to use other tools out there when they would really like to have something customized just for what they want. As these tools get better, those people are your new coders. And really, we're probably not even going to be calling them coders. We're going to be calling them makers, right? They're the people who are just coming up with these ideas, going out, making it happen. Maybe then they'll have, someone in the organization that they pass off to who does a security audit of the code, helps them deploy it, that kind of thing. But a lot of the key ideas are going to come from people who are not the traditional sort of coder slash product manager who understands code.
Right. It's interesting because we actually kind of already moved into this last point we were going to cover, Sam, right? This point 3, which is the grand prize, right? Becoming the starting point for the agentic world. We've kind of touched on this, right? It's becoming that primary interface for agentic workflows and the need for OpenAI to be there with a Windsurf, right? It has this massive user base and head started distribution, right? That's its key advantage right now. It needs to keep it. So that's why it's potentially buying Windsurf. But, the thing we haven't really touched on is Google's significant challenge there, right? Is when you think about kind of a soup to nuts from that mind share you were talking about, the importance of being in people's minds. Google is there at every step of the way with an option, right? The significant challenge for Google is that it has 5 or 6 different starting points, right? And it actually came up during the last earnings call where analysts were kind of peppering Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, with, hey, you've got a lot of different plays. It's fragmented. You've got your Google homepage, right? You've got Vertex. You've got AI Studio, or you've got Agent Space. You've got the Gemini app. We could go on. You've got AI mode, right? Which hasn't even really been made official, I think, right? So which suggests something that OpenAI can potentially exploit if it's moving quickly enough, right? Google's long had these question marks around whether it can actually execute, right? The technology prowess, yes, it had better infrastructure for the cloud, right? But Microsoft and AWS out executed Google. There's questions around timing, of course, but at the same time, right? You've noted this. I've noted this, talking with the Googlers, right? Is they're pretty confident under the now Gemini leadership, Josh Woodward, the Google leadership is really focused on this. But where do they take that starting point? Is there a need for this starting point, Sam?
And of course, yeah, I would say there's definitely a need, right? The challenge at the moment is no one knows what that starting point is going to be, right? So Google's basically making multiple bets. And on some of those bets they've done really well, like AI Studio. That's basically been a big hit. And on some of them, they've up until recently they haven't done well, like the Gemini app, right? The consumer Gemini app. Now, Josh Woodward has taken over that, like you mentioned. Since he's taken over, we've already seen how quickly they're changing things. If you look at his account on Twitter, he's literally telling people, hey, tell me what pisses you off about this app and we will try and fix it, right? And you got to admire that. And you got to admire that literally, they rolled out the other day the new version of 2.5. And within hours, that was now in the Gemini app. That's opposed to 3 months ago, where it was taking weeks for that Gemini app to get the latest models. So I don't know what's happened, right? But someone's probably banged some heads together, and that is now getting fixed. So does that become the starting point? I don't know, right? It's funny that I definitely find myself doing less Google searches compared to the past. I think a lot of people, if you just ask yourself, that's got to be something that's a concern for them. There was an interesting thing that their stock price dropped, after Apple basically said for the first time in 20 years, the amount of Google searches on their devices had gone down last month. That's got to be worrying to them. But at the same time, if they can transition people to one of these newer starting points, and maybe they end up transitioning people to a couple of them. Maybe it becomes, Google search and the Gemini app. And when people want the sort of experience of LLM search and, just talking to something, they will go to the Gemini app. When they want to, go for the traditional search with the 10 blue links, they will go to Google search.
Right. Yeah. And what I did not say is I think Sundar responded to those analyst questions, along the lines that you just suggested. Hey, it's early and we need multiple plays. We need to have these various starting points to see which one's working. It's also not clear to me, Sam, whether you actually have the network effects that you had in search, right? Where Google became that starting point because the ecosystem needed it, right? You needed supply, right, and you needed demand, right? And so there was this effect, right, this marketplace. I don't see the same thing happening here. In fact, it could be the opposite. It just feels like there's this starting interface, right, that needs to be super simple, where you could just write in a prompt, and then there's this agentic flow that starts. So if I need a CRM, maybe Salesforce can allow me to go there. Right. If I need, social network, right, Meta's going to have me covered there. And if I need to do something on the developer side, right, you've got all these players. It seems to be kind of more an open garden right now versus a closed garden. And that's the big difference that's happened over the last year.
It's certainly going to be interesting to see how it plays out. One of the quotes that I really liked from our conversation with Richard Sirota, right, is where we were sort of asking him, well, you guys were late to the agent game, and and he pointed out, yeah, we were the 26th search engine as well, right? That kind of drove it home nicely and sort of reframed it all, that maybe you don't need to be first, you just need to be last, right? You just need to be the one that wins in the end. And look, it's certainly going to be a very tough job for Google. And certainly, at the moment, we're seeing the strong competition come from OpenAI more than from anyone else. I'm not seeing it coming from Microsoft. I'm not seeing it come from, other places, etc. But it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see, what is that underlying force for pull, right? Is it the underlying model intelligence? Is it the UI, UX, which a lot of people think? Is it the ecosystem of tools and plugins that enterprise decision makers are interested in, right? The data integration capabilities or trust and reliability. There's all these different factors that are playing out. So when it comes to our listeners and viewers, right, how does enterprise adoption play into this? What are their needs besides having the sandbox that we talked about earlier, a place to discover, build, and then convert into their own ecosystems, right? So Google has this pretty compelling end-to-end play. Now, OpenAI is articulating how it's going to have that end-to-end play as well. Great conversation, Sam. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out.